The whispers started before Katie Rodriguez even finished her first week at Seattle General. Forged credentials. Diploma mill license. Dangerous. Dr. Mercer had seeded them so carefully that by her third month, half the ICU staff moved around her like she carried something contagious. He never said these things directly, he was too sharp for that. Instead, he'd catch an intern's eye during rounds and let his expression do the work. A subtle shake of the head. A knowing pause. The kind of theater that destroyed reputations without leaving fingerprints. Katie kept her head down through it all. She'd survived 2 tours at Bagram Airfield under mortar fire, carried wounded Marines through corridors paved with shrapnel and blood, held a 19-year-old private's hand while he died in the dark. Rumors were nothing. Just noise. She checked her vitals, charted her hours, moved through the fluorescent-lit corridors of Seattle General with the invisible efficiency of someone trained to operate in spaces where mistakes meant death. The antiseptic smell of the ICU became her camouflage. She disappeared into it. The tension escalated on a Tuesday in her 12th week. Dr. Mercer stood at the medication cart during morning rounds, reviewing dosages for a post-operative cardiac patient. Katie watched from across the unit as he wrote the order in his precise, arrogant hand. 70 micrograms per kilogram. She ran the math in her head, the way she always did, because pain was information and numbers were her language. The patient weighed 89 kilograms. The order was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. It would stop the man's heart. An intern stood beside Mercer, young and nervous, waiting to be impressed. Katie moved toward the medication cart like she was drawn on rails, her movements economical and purposeful. She didn't rush. Rushing looked unprofessional. She simply appeared at Mercer's elbow and said, quiet enough that only he and the intern could hear, dosage calculation error, doctor. 50 micrograms per kilogram for this patient's weight and renal function. The room didn't change. The monitors kept beeping. The ventilators kept wheezing their mechanical rhythm. But Mercer's jaw tightened, and his eyes found hers with a flash of something predatory and cold. An intern had just watched the ICU charge nurse, the man who was supposed to be infallible, get corrected by the quiet new nurse in her 3rd month. An intern would tell 3 other people before lunch. By evening, the narrative had solidified. She hadn't corrected him. She'd challenged his authority. She'd humiliated him in front of a subordinate. And everyone understood now what kind of person did that. The kind with something to hide. The kind who'd probably gotten her license through some online diploma mill and was too desperate to keep her job to let a small thing like respect for hierarchy get in the way. She felt the shift in the break room when she sat down with her coffee that night. Nurses grabbed their lunches and scattered like she'd brought disease through the door. She didn't react. Her jaw clenched once, briefly, the only crack in her composure, and then she drank her cold coffee in silence, staring at the staff schedules on the corkboard like they contained the meaning of existence. Katie's apartment was 6 blocks from the hospital, a studio she'd rented under her civilian name with enough operational distance to disappear into if the cover fractured. She walked there through the San Antonio heat, her scrubs damp with sweat, her mind already 1,000 miles away. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat. She ran her fingers over it each morning before work, a ritual, a reminder of who she actually was when nobody was looking. Captain Katie Rodriguez. 3 confirmed kills. 17 consecutive trauma surgeries under mortar fire. Naval Cross recipient. Call sign, Reaper. None of that mattered here. Here, she was just the new nurse. The one with the questionable credentials. The one who didn't fight back. The patient arrived by military transport on a Wednesday morning. Katie was running labs on a post-op in room 401 when the overhead announcement crackled through, incoming trauma, ETA 10 minutes. Marine General Officer, German Transit, critical. The words landed like a fist to her sternum. She kept her hand steady as she finished drawing blood from the patient's central line. Steady hands didn't show fear. Steady hands showed nothing. The medical team converged on the ICU like a choreographed swarm. Trauma surgeons, intensive care specialists, a lieutenant commander from Bethesda Naval Hospital Medical Center who moved with the kind of authority that came from fixing people on the edge of gone. They wheeled the patient into room 408 at the far end of the ICU, the unit's most secure location, the one they reserved for the dying and the powerful and the dying powerful. Katie glimpsed the patient for exactly 2 seconds as they rushed him past her station. Early 50s, grey at the temples, shrapnel wounds visible across his left side where the surgeons at Ramstein had already gone in once and failed to stop the internal bleeding. The kind of wounds you got when a mortar round came through the roof of a battalion aid station. The kind of wounds Katie had treated before. In different uniforms. Different wars. She felt something shift in her chest when she read his name on the admit form. Captain Marcus Webb. Battalion Medic, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. The man who'd taken over her aid station after her reassignment to the Joint Special Operations Command. The man who'd been doing her exact job when the mortar round came through the ceiling and changed everything. She didn't move for a moment. Just stood there holding the clipboard, her eyes fixed on those 4 syllables like they were written in a language she'd forgotten she knew. Marcus Webb. Alive. Barely. Bleeding out from wounds that should have killed him twice over. And he was here, in room 408, behind the glass partition of the ICU's critical care section, at the exact moment she was deep undercover gathering intelligence on medical record breaches that were funneling classified information about returning Marines to foreign buyers. The mission parameters had just shifted beneath her feet like tectonic plates grinding against each other. Rodriguez. Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the ICU like a scalpel. Room 408. Initial vitals and line assessment. Now. She was moving before his sentence ended, muscle memory taking over, her hands already reaching for the sterile gloves on her cart. Mercer appeared in her peripheral vision as she approached the glass partition, watching her, his expression unreadable. She could feel the weight of his attention the way you could feel a sniper's scope even from 1,000 yards. He was testing something. Pushing. Waiting to see if she'd crack under the pressure of proximity to a critical case. She didn't crack. Katie entered room 408 with her composure sealed tight as a combat helmet. The patient lay on the trauma bed with 3 central lines already running, blood products hanging from the transfusion warmer, a ventilator breathing for him in steady mechanical pulses. His chest rose and fell. His monitors beat their vital song. His eyes were closed, mercifully unconscious, spared the moment of recognition that was building like a second heartbeat in Katie's throat. She checked the central lines. She verified the ventilator settings. She documented his current vitals with clinical precision, blood pressure 94/58 and dropping, heart rate 118, respiration rate 16, O2 saturation 92% on the ventilator. Internal bleeding. The surgeons at Ramstein had repaired the primary hemorrhage, but something, a secondary bleed, a vessel they'd missed, tissue damage they hadn't accounted for, was still killing him from the inside. 6 hours. That's what the surgical team had given him, if he didn't bleed out before the next intervention. Katie's hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. She simply stood there at the bedside of the man who'd taken over her mission when she'd been pulled, the man she'd trained and mentored and watched take a mortar round meant for her, and she said what any competent ICU nurse would say, "I'll monitor him continuously. His pressures are dropping. We need to get him back to the OR." When she turned to leave the room, Dr. Mercer was standing on the other side of the glass partition with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable and his eyes tracking her with the kind of predatory focus that meant he was already planning his next move. She didn't look at him. She simply moved back to her station, pulled up the continuous monitoring feeds for room 408, and began the 6-hour watch that would determine whether Captain Marcus Webb lived or died on her shift, and whether her entire cover story fractured before she could figure out why he was bleeding out in the first place. The mission had just become personal. The first time Dr. Mercer weaponized room 408, Katie's composure didn't crack. It bent. That was all. She'd been adjusting the propofol drip when his voice cut through the ICU like a scalpel, sharp and deliberate and loud enough to carry past the open door. "Rodriguez, explain to me how you calculated this rate." He stood in the doorway with the chart held at arm's length, as though her handwriting might contaminate his fingers. Mrs. Webb sat rigid in the visitor's chair beside her husband's bed, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The two sons, mid-20s, both with their father's shoulders and his jaw, watched the exchange the way soldiers watch ambushes they can't prevent. Katie moved toward him with the same steady pace she'd use approaching a wounded soldier in a firefight. No rush. No hesitation. Just forward momentum. "The dose is 10 milligrams per kilogram per minute," she said quietly. "General Webb weighs 94 kilograms. Current drip rate reflects." "I didn't ask for a lecture." Mercer's voice climbed higher. "I asked you to explain how you calculated it, which suggests to me that you don't actually understand the calculation, which means you probably don't understand basic pharmacology either, which means I'm genuinely curious how you managed to get hired at this hospital." He turned toward Mrs. Webb with an expression of exaggerated concern. "Your husband has already survived one catastrophe. I'm trying to prevent a second one caused by staff with, shall we say, questionable credentials." The room didn't just go quiet. It crystallized. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The heart monitor beeped in steady 4-beat intervals. Somewhere down the corridor, a code cart rolled past, its wheels squeaking against tile. Katie's jaw muscle tightened once. 2 seconds of visible tension beneath her skin. Then it released. "The math is sound, doctor." Her voice had dropped half an octave, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "The patient is stable. The infusion rate is appropriate." Mercer smiled. It was the smile of a man holding a knife, studying where to press. "You know what I find fascinating? The absolute certainty in your voice. That kind of confidence usually comes from experience. Real experience. Not online certifications or diploma mill degrees." He glanced at Mrs. Webb. "Has anyone actually verified where Captain Webb's nurse trained?" The use of Webb's rank was deliberate. A reminder of hierarchy. A suggestion that this woman in scrubs belonged somewhere far below a man wearing rank himself, even if that rank had never been earned in anything resembling actual combat. Katie took the chart from Mercer's hand without asking. Her movements were precise, economical, the kind of efficiency that comes from doing critical things under fire. She'd performed field thoracotomies with a combat knife and a headlamp, so adjusting a medication drip while being publicly dismantled felt almost routine. "I'll continue monitoring the drip. General Webb will be fine." "Will he?" Mercer's voice followed her as she turned back toward the monitor. "Because from where I'm standing, I'm not entirely convinced anyone in this room actually knows what they're doing." 3 nurses at the station froze mid-charting. One of them looked away so fast her chair spun slightly. By the time Katie returned to the ICU proper, word had already begun moving through the unit like contagion, whispers about credentials, about where she'd really trained, about whether someone should check into her background before she killed someone. The break room at 1400 was the real test. Katie sat with a turkey sandwich and a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, reading a nursing journal article on hemodynamic monitoring with the same focus she'd use reading an intelligence briefing. The break room was a small space, linoleum counters, a refrigerator that hummed like it was dying, a table pushed against the window overlooking the parking garage. Safe. Quiet. The kind of place where people let their armor down. Then Sarah walked in. Second-year nurse, capable, had asked Katie's help 2 weeks ago threading a central line in a difficult patient. Katie had talked her through it, anatomy, landmarks, angle of approach, and the line had seated perfectly on the first try. Sarah had been grateful then. Sarah didn't meet her eyes now. She grabbed her lunch from the refrigerator, saw Katie at the table, and her entire body language shifted. The coffee cup came out of the cabinet. The half-eaten sandwich from the fridge. Her movements accelerated from casual to urgent. "Sarah." Katie's voice was neutral. "How's the Caldwell patient on your rotation?" Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she gathered her things. "Not fear. Not exactly. But something close to it. The kind of trembling that came from being caught between two people, forced to choose which side of a line to stand on. He's stable, I think." She didn't wait for more. She left, taking her uneaten sandwich with her, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss. Within 30 seconds, 2 more nurses stood up. One of them was Marissa, who'd borrowed Katie's personal copy of the PCCN exam study guide last month and returned it with notes written in the margins. They didn't look at Katie as they left. They just left, their movement synchronized like a school of fish detecting a predator. Katie finished her coffee. It tasted like metal and old regret. By shift change at 1700, the break room had become a place where she sat alone, the silence so thick you could operate in it. She'd learned silence long ago, learned that composure under pressure was just another form of combat readiness. No tears. No trembling. No breakdown in the supply closet. Just mechanical chewing, steady breathing, and the absolute certainty that Mercer was orchestrating something larger than casual cruelty. The write-up appeared on the unit board at 1847. It was white paper, standard hospital issue, with red marker bleeding through from pressure. The letters were large and deliberate, positioned at eye level on the cork board where every incoming staff member would see it. Rodriguez, K. Repeated protocol violations, under review. Just those words. Just her name. Just enough to plant questions that her presence would never be able to answer. Katie read it once. Her jaw muscle jumped beneath her skin, visible, undeniable proof that something in her had reacted to this. 2 seconds of tension. Then her face smoothed again, became neutral as stone, and she reached up to adjust a push-pin that didn't need adjusting. From 10 feet away, it probably looked like she was making sure the notice stayed in place. No one would understand that she was counting the millimeters of space between the letters, the exact pressure of the marker, the way the red was slightly darker on the left side where Mercer had pressed harder. Everything was data. Everything was information. Composure meant you could catalog the specifics of your own humiliation without letting it crack you in half. She didn't cry in the supply closet. She didn't rage at the charge nurse. She didn't demand an explanation or threaten to call HR. She simply returned to room 408, checked General Wedd's vitals with the same clinical precision she'd use on any unconscious patient, logged the numbers in his chart, and positioned herself at the monitoring station with sight lines to all 3 ICU entrances, all for medication carts, and every single access point where someone might approach the patient she wasn't supposed to care about. The mission was deteriorating. She could feel it. Mercer was competent in his cruelty, systematic, strategic, the kind of bullying that came from having spent years studying how to dismantle people through institutional weaponization. He wasn't just trying to make her look bad. He was trying to isolate her completely, remove her from proximity to Webb, eliminate her as a variable in something he clearly understood that she didn't. At 21:45, as the evening shift began to settle into their rhythms and the ICU moved into that peculiar quiet that only happened after dark, Katie's encrypted phone buzzed once in the pocket of her scrubs. She didn't check it immediately. She just felt the vibration, kept her hand steady on the charting, and waited exactly 90 seconds before excusing herself to the restroom. The message was waiting at anomalous access to patient records 1830 to 1845. Photograph confirmed. Stay close to target. Mission priority unchanged. She deleted it. She flushed the toilet to match the timeline. She washed her hands with the same methodical care she'd use after handling contaminated materials. And when she returned to the ICU, her face showed nothing but the professional concern of a nurse checking in on her assigned patients. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Captain Marcus Webb, unconscious, sedated, his body still bleeding into itself despite 3 separate surgeries and 18 units of blood product, was the only person in this hospital who could confirm what she actually was. And he was the one person she couldn't let Mercer anywhere near. The monitor alarm didn't scream so much as shriek, a sound like metal tearing, sharp and sustained and wrong in a way that made the fluorescent light seem to flicker in response. Katie's eyes snapped up from the medication cart where she'd been documenting the evening rounds, her pupils contracting as she read the numbers scrolling across the display: blood pressure 80/50. Then 70/40. Then the cascade began, each number dropping like someone was pulling a plug from the patient's tank, watching him deflate in real time. Room for 08. Webb. She was moving before the charge nurse registered the sound, her shoes silent on polished floors that had been mopped at 2,100 hours. She'd timed it, had always timed everything, and her muscle memory was already running calculations that civilian nurses didn't possess. Pressure that critical. That fast. The surgical team had closed him 4 hours ago after the third transfusion, after removing 17 pieces of shrapnel from his abdomen and thorax, after using 2 liters of topical hemostatic powder in a cavity that looked like someone had poured broken glass through his abdomen. Internal bleeding. The kind that didn't announce itself with external signs until the patient was already in free fall. She hit the code button with the heel of her hand as she crossed the threshold into room for 08, the red button flush-mounted in the wall. There was something almost obscene about how easily it activated, how much gravity it carried. One touch and the machinery of a hospital's emergency response began its choreography. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she moved to Webb's bedside, her hands already reaching for the crash cart, muscle memory taking over with the precision of someone who'd done this in conditions vastly more hostile than an air-conditioned ICU in San Antonio. "I need the attending, now," she said, her voice even, conversational, the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse. The charge nurse, Chen, stood frozen in the doorway, new, third-month rotation, hadn't yet learned to move when the ground shifted beneath patients' vital signs. Katie pulled the code cart closer, its wheels squeaking against tile. "Get me 2 large-bore 4 lines, O-negative blood in the rapid infuser, and stat labs. Now, Chen." The charge nurse moved. Katie's fingers found Webb's radial pulse, thready, too fast, the beat of a heart working to compensate for a tank that was running dry. His skin had taken on that particular shade of gray that meant his body was pulling blood from the periphery, shunting everything central in a last-ditch effort to keep the brain and heart oxygenated. She'd seen this color before. She'd watched men die wearing it, their bodies betraying the instruction to stay alive. The wall phone crackled to life. "Code blue, room for 08, Chen's voice, tight with adrenaline. "Patient is Marine General Webb, post-operative day 1, internal bleed, requesting attending physician support." 30 seconds of silence. Then Dr. Mercer's voice came through the speaker, not panicked, that would have been too honest, but irritated, the tone of a man being interrupted from something he considered more important. "Rodriguez on the case." Katie was already running the needle into Webb's arm, finding the vein with the kind of certainty that came from having done this in moving vehicles under fire. The catheter slid home with barely a whisper. "Yes, sir, Rodriguez is present," Chen answered. "She probably just can't read the monitor correctly," Mercer said. His voice had that edge to it, the one he'd been using since she'd corrected his dosage calculation in front of that intern. The one that said he was still turning the knife. "Have her recalibrate it. Tell her to double-check her technique. I'm sure it's operator error." The words hit the room like a physical thing. Katie didn't pause. Her hands continued moving, pulling the second full line, running fluids wide open, typing orders into the bedside computer with the mechanical efficiency of someone operating on pure tactical calculation. But something in her jaw tightened, just once, a muscle contracting and releasing in the space of a heartbeat. Operator error. While her patient's pressure was 60/35 and falling. Chen's face had gone pale. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then repeated Mercer's message anyway, the message of a doctor telling his staff that the only nurse standing between his patient and death was incompetent. Katie watched the charge nurse's eyes track to her, saw the uncertainty bloom there, the moment where belief wavered. In a functional unit, Chen would have pushed back. In a unit run by a man like Mercer, she just passed along the insult like it was medicine. "Get me a crash cart with open thoracotomy supplies," Katie said quietly. And get me the surgical attending actually present in the building. Not on the phone. Present. Here. Katie, Dr. Mercer said. I know what he said. She was opening the second floor line now, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in humps with nothing but a headlamp and the sounds of gunfire outside. The needle went in clean. Blood backed up immediately, that rich arterial color that meant she'd hit the target. Log that I requested attending physician support. Log the time. Log that it was denied. Log it now, Chen. The charge nurse's fingers trembled as she typed. Webb's oxygen saturation was 89 and dropping, the monitors beeping, accelerating like a metronome wound too tight. The ventilator could only deliver so much oxygen if the blood wasn't there to carry it, and his blood volume was disappearing into a cavity that should have been sealed. Katie looked at his face, sedated, paralyzed, utterly vulnerable, and made the decision that would blow 2 years of undercover work into pieces. She reached into the crash cart and pulled out the equipment she'd personal stocked 3 weeks ago, the supplies that didn't belong on a civilian crash cart in a civilian hospital in San Antonio. A sterile scalpel from the trauma field kit she kept tucked behind the regulation supplies. Rib spreaders that had been designed for combat conditions, for field thoracotomies, for situations where a hospital wasn't an option and you had to become one. Katie, what are you? Chen's voice cracked. I'm going on break after I finish here, Katie said quietly, and there was something in her tone, not humor exactly, but the dark companionship of someone who understood that the world had just split into before and after. After I saved the general's life. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't wait for Mercer to call back with another dismissal. She didn't wait for authorization or a surgeon or the machinery of institutional permission to grind into motion. What she did was move her hands in patterns she'd learned on the floor of a battalion aid station at Bagram Airfield, under mortar fire, with nothing between her and shrapnel but a Kevlar helmet and the kind of focus that only came when the alternative was watching someone die. The scalpel found skin at the fourth intercostal space, left anterolateral thoracotomy approach, and Katie made the incision with the same pressure she'd used to cut through fabric, controlled, precise, knowing exactly where every vital structure lay beneath the surface. Blood welled immediately, the hiss of air escaping, and she was already reaching for the rib spreaders, positioning them to crack the chest cavity open like someone opening a door to a room she'd been inside 100 times before. The monitor showed Webb's heart was still beating. Barely. But beating. Her hands moved on their own now, 6 years of military medical training activated in the ICU of a civilian hospital at 0208 hours in San Antonio, Texas, while a charge nurse stood frozen in the doorway and Dr. Mercer was about to walk into the understanding that his sabotage had just forced a nurse to become something far more dangerous than any protocol violation could ever be. The surgical team would arrive in minutes. But those minutes were hers, and her hands had held lives together in far worse conditions than this. She began the manual compression, her fingers and palm working the structure of Webb's heart, feeling it respond beneath her hands, the organ compliance that told her he was still there, still worth saving, still the man who'd handed her a unit patch on the day he took over her aid station and told her never to give up. And that was the moment when the entire trajectory of her mission, her cover, her carefully constructed civilian existence, began its collapse into something nobody had anticipated. The scalpel was smaller than she remembered. Sterile. Cold against her palm like a blade she'd held 1,000 times before, which she had, just never in this context, never in a hospital that didn't have mortar rounds for accompaniment. The crash cart had everything she needed: rib spreaders, hemostats, clamps, tools designed for organized emergency response, which was almost funny because organized response required a surgeon, and there was no surgeon, just Katie Rodriguez with a patient exsanguinating into his own chest cavity and a doctor who'd refused her calls because he didn't believe she could read a monitor correctly. The vein throbbed in Webb's neck. His oxygen sat was 63 and dropping like a stone through water, and the ventilator was screaming a mechanical protest because his lungs were drowning in blood that shouldn't be there, blood that German surgeons in Ramstein had supposedly controlled but hadn't, blood that meant he was hours from dead. Her hands moved. Muscle memory took over, the kind that came from field conditions, from doing this inside a shot-up Humvee at Bagram with nothing but a headlamp and a Marine bleeding out because a mortar round didn't distinguish between officers and enlisted, between medics and soldiers. The incision went in clean. Left anterolateral thoracotomy, fourth intercostal space, feeling the resistance of skin and muscle and then the give of the pleural cavity. The rib spreaders clicked into place and the chest opened like a door she'd opened before, and Webb's heart was right there, pale and barely moving, drowning in blood. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. Her left hand went in and her fingers found the apex of the heart and began the compressions, steady, firm, feeling the organ respond beneath her touch like it was a puzzle piece that wanted to fit back into the rhythm of living. Her right hand was already working the hemostats, clamping the first bleeder she could identify, the blood so dark it was almost black, telling her it was old blood, stored blood, blood that meant he'd been bleeding for hours while Mercer refused her backup. The clock on the wall read 0217. Her jaw clenched once as she worked, but it was the only crack in her composure. No trembling. No hesitation. Just hands that had learned trauma surgery on a mountain at 10,000 feet under enemy fire, hands that understood pain was information and blood was data and Webb's pulse was the only metric that mattered. She identified the second bleeder, a small vessel she could feel but not see, bleeding slowly into the pericardial space. Clamp. The third was larger, more aggressive, and she had to adjust her hand position to access it, her left hand still maintaining compression, still feeling the fragile flutter of his heart responding to her touch. Her breathing was controlled. Measured. The kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst, and Bagram was definitely the worst, so whatever happened in this ICU room was just another chapter in a long book of things that tried to kill you and didn't quite manage it. The fourth bleeder was below the pulmonary artery, which made it tricky because one wrong move and she'd compromise his oxygenation permanently. She repositioned, her shoulder aching as she leaned deeper, feeling for the bleeding point like she was reading Braille written in a language only trauma knew. The hemostat went in smooth. Clamp. The blood flow slowed. At 0301, the fifth bleeder was bleeding from the left pulmonary vein, and she had to use a satin sky clamp to control it without completely severing the vessel. The clamp was bigger than a hemostat, more precise, and her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators that had learned surgery in places where you didn't get a second surgery if you made a mistake. The vein stopped bleeding. Webb's blood pressure, which had been bottoming out in the 60s, crept up to 72. The sixth bleeder took another 20 minutes because it was deep, underneath the inferior vena cava, and she had to work around the anatomy like she was diffusing a bomb made of human tissue. Her left hand never stopped. The compressions continued, steady as a metronome, feeling his heart gradually strengthen under the rhythm of her palm. Clamp. Suction. Identify. Work. By 0347, the seventh and final major bleeder was sealed, and Webb's vital signs had stabilized into something that approximated life. His oxygen sat was climbing, 84% and holding. His blood pressure was 1/68. The heart monitor showed a rhythm that was actually sinus, actually regular, actually the heartbeat of a man who was going to live if she could keep him alive for another hour, another 30 minutes, another 15 seconds. Her scrubs were soaked dark with blood. Not just her gloves, her scrubs, her shirt, seeping through to the skin underneath. She looked like she'd been through a combat casualty extraction, which she had, just not the kind that happened in hums on mountain roads. The kind that happened in an ICU room at 0402 on a Tuesday morning with a doctor who hated her and a patient she'd promised never to abandon. The surgical team arrived at 0420 because a respiratory therapist named Maria had walked past room 408, had seen the chest open, had seen Katie's hands inside Webb's thoracic cavity, and had run to the surgical wing like she was evacuating a building with an active threat. The attending surgeon came first, followed by 2 residents and a surgical nurse, and all of them stopped in the doorway like they'd walked into a war crime. "How long?" the attending asked, his voice so quiet Katie almost didn't hear it. 2 hours 17 minutes, Katie said. Not boasting. Just data. 7 identified bleeders. Manual cardiac compression continuous. O2 sat climbing. Sinus rhythm stable for the last 4 minutes. The attending surgeon stepped forward, and his eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, full of understanding that what he was witnessing didn't fit inside any standard hospital protocol. A civilian nurse was not supposed to open a chest. A civilian nurse was not supposed to know where the bleedings were. A civilian nurse was not supposed to have hands steady enough to work in a thoracic cavity without dropping a clamp or severing something critical. But Katie stepped back anyway, just like a proper civilian nurse would do, and let the surgical team take over. She peeled off her gloves. They made that distinctive snap sound, rubber hitting air, and her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from 6 hours of sustained manual compression, from maintaining a heartbeat with nothing but her palm and her muscle memory and the knowledge that this particular Marine had taken over her battalion aid station when she'd been reassigned, had been doing her exact job when the mortar round came in, had earned his wounds trying to keep her people alive. The surgeons worked fast. 2 hours. That was how long it took them to finish the repairs she'd started, to close the bleedings she'd identified, to do the proper surgical work that came after someone had kept the patient alive long enough to matter. By 06:37, Webb's chest was closed. His vitals were stable. He was going to survive this, which meant Katie's cover was about to explode. She walked to the locker room to wash. The blood wouldn't come off immediately. It had dried in the creases of her palms, under her fingernails, in the lines of her hands that had learned to hold lives together in places where hospitals didn't exist. She scrubbed anyway, watching the water run pink and then clear, watching 2 years of undercover work circle down the drain like blood going back where it came from. Security found her at 0815. Mercer was waiting outside the locker room with 2 security officers, and his face was the color of a bruise, a vein throbbing at his temple like it was trying to escape his skull. He didn't speak. He just held out his hand, and Katie understood the gesture. "Badge," he said quietly. "Now." She unclipped it from her scrub pocket, the laminated ID that said Katie Rodriguez, RN, Seattle General, and placed it in his palm. Her composure was perfect. No trembling. No hesitation. Just a nurse handing over her credentials to an administrator who'd activated something irreversible. "You're suspended pending investigation," Mercer continued, his voice gaining volume as they walked toward the exit. "Performing unauthorized surgical procedures. Violating protocol. Exceeding your scope of practice." Each word was a gift he was giving himself, each sentence a small victory. "You'll be hearing from the Texas Board of Nursing within 24 hours. Katie didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Behind the glass doors of the ICU, she could see him moving already, Mercer pulling his phone from his pocket before she'd even reached the elevator, his face twisted with the expression of a man who'd finally found the leverage to destroy someone, who'd been waiting for this moment since she'd corrected his dosage calculation 3 months ago in front of an intern. 3 phone calls. That's what it took. The first was to a board member who owed him a favor from a malpractice suit in 2019. The second was to another board member, this one connected through a golf league. The third was to the Texas Board of Nursing, demanding an emergency investigation into Katie Rodriguez's credentials, requesting immediate suspension of her license pending review. By noon, his former colleague at the Pentagon was making inquiries, asking pointed questions about someone named Katie Rodriguez in military databases, asking why a civilian nurse would have combat surgical training, asking things that made classified files start moving in classified ways. And Katie was sitting in an empty diner at 3 in the morning, staring at her reflection in a window that was dark as a mirror, watching everything she'd built circle the drain. The phone call started before Katie's shift ended. She heard about them third hand, a unit clerk mentioning that Dr. Mercer had been in the administrator's office with the door closed, his voice carrying that particular edge it got when he was pulling strings. By the time Katie finished charting at 0800, the rumor mill had already spun into overdrive. Mercer had called 3 board members. Friends from his residency. People who owed him favors. People who answered when he said jump. By 1100, a formal notice appeared in her email inbox. Suspension pending investigation. Her badge was confiscated at the unit desk. A nurse supervisor stood there with the expression of someone handling something contaminated, avoiding eye contact as she extended her hand. Katie placed the badge in her palm without comment. The laminated plastic caught the fluorescent light as it was taken away, and she watched it disappear into an envelope marked with her name in black marker. "It's temporary," the supervisor said. She wasn't meeting Katie's eyes. "The Board of Nursing is just reviewing your credentials. It's routine in situations like this." Situations like what? Katie thought but didn't say. Situations where you save a patient's life using combat surgical techniques you aren't supposed to know. Situations where you crack a man's chest in an ICU with tools meant for minor trauma, where your hands move like they've done it 100 times under artillery fire, where the only explanation is a truth you can't speak. The next call came from the Texas Board of Nursing. An emergency investigation had been opened. The investigator would need to schedule an interview. Did Captain Rodriguez? No, just Ms. Rodriguez, just the civilian nurse. Did she understand the seriousness of the allegations? Unauthorized medical procedures. Performing surgery outside her scope of practice. Potentially fraudulent credentials. Katie listened to the message in her car in the parking lot. The sun was already hot enough to make the windshield shimmer. She didn't call back immediately. She sat there, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and watched the afternoon traffic move past Seattle General's main entrance. Ambulances came and went. Staff rotated in and out. The hospital ran on without her. It would run on without her for weeks. Possibly forever. The worst part wasn't the investigation. The worst part was knowing why Mercer had triggered it. Not because he believed she'd done anything wrong. He knew exactly how skilled she was, had watched her perform a 6-hour field thoracotomy with the precision of a deployed field surgeon. The investigation was punishment. It was the nuclear option. It was the only way to make her disappear without getting his hands dirty. And it was working. By early afternoon, a third call had reached her through a forwarded email. A Pentagon contact, someone Mercer knew from a lecture series years ago, someone with access to military databases, had started asking questions. Pointed questions. Why would a civilian nurse have the medical credentials to perform combat surgery? Why would her name appear in military training records from 2017? Why would there be a gap of 6 months in her work history that aligned with a Marine deployment to Bagram Airfield? The walls were closing in. The careful cover story, 2 years of civilian nursing, 3 references from the private sector, a background that could withstand casual scrutiny but not intensive Pentagon-level investigation, was collapsing. And Katie couldn't defend it. She couldn't say she was Captain Katie Rodriguez, Naval Intelligence, operating under deep cover for counterintelligence purposes. She couldn't say that her combat surgical knowledge came from actual combat. She couldn't explain any of it without exposing the entire operation. So she sat in an empty diner on Nogales Street at 0300 that morning, 3 hours after getting the call from the Pentagon investigator, and she stared into a cup of black coffee that had gone cold. The diner was nearly empty, just an old man reading a newspaper in the corner and a single waitress moving between stations with the mechanical precision of someone halfway through a 14-hour shift. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that Katie had come to associate with places where people waited for bad news. Her reflection stared back at her from the window. Dark circles under her eyes. Hair pulled back so tight it pulled at her temples. The face of someone watching 2 years of careful work circle the drain. The face of someone who'd made a choice at 0203 hours and was now paying the price for it. She'd had her orders. Stay close to the asset. Observe and report. Don't compromise the mission. And she'd done the first 2 things perfectly, invisibly, for 27 months. But when Marcus Webb's vital signs crashed, when his pressure dropped to nothing and the surgical team wasn't coming fast enough and Mercer was actively sabotaging the call for backup, she'd made the choice that ended everything. She'd saved his life instead of protecting her mission. The coffee had rings of residue on the interior of the cup. She traced them with her thumbnail, thinking about how long it took for liquid to stain ceramic, how the marks remained even after everything else was washed away. Some evidence couldn't be erased. The next morning, a Marine liaison officer arrived at Seattle General with a folder and a citation. Katie's escort back to collect her personal belongings was awkward and formal, a human resources manager walking beside her as if she might bolt or cause a scene. They walked through the ICU in silence. Nurses looked away. The break room door was closed. The unit board still displayed her write-up in red marker, the words repeated protocol violations glowing like a neon sign. Room for 08. Webb was awake. His eyes tracked her movement across the unit with sudden, focused recognition. Not the blank stare of the sedated, not the confused gaze of the concussed. Full awareness. Full clarity. And his voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Reaper. The old call sign. The one from Bagram. The one that carried across the quiet ICU and froze Katie's blood in her veins. That was her code name at the battalion aid station. That was who she was when she was pulling shrapnel from flesh and deciding who lived and who didn't based on nothing but training and triage protocol. Nobody here knew that name. Nobody here was supposed to know it. The Marine liaison officer, a colonel with 3 rows of ribbons and eyes that had seen things, stepped forward. He opened the folder. He began to read. Captain Katie Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps. His voice was calm. Ceremonial. Awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism at Bagram Airfield, where she performed 17 consecutive trauma surgeries under enemy fire, maintaining a 97% survival rate despite sustained mortar and small arms fire, operating without anesthesia for the final 4 hours, and ultimately evacuating 42 critical casualties through a controlled medical extraction while the aid station sustained direct hits. Mercer burst through the door halfway through the 3rd medal, the Silver Star for leadership under extreme duress, and his face was already flushed purple with rage. That's insane, this is fabricated, she performed an authorized surgery. The 3-star general who'd arrived from the Pentagon overnight cut him off with a voice like a rifle shot. It was the kind of voice that made the air pressure change, made everyone in the room understand immediately that they were in the presence of power that didn't need to be loud to be absolute. That's Captain Rodriguez, Doctor. And the investigation you triggered into her background flagged some interesting anomalies in your own service. The general stepped closer to Mercer, and for the first time, Katie saw real fear flicker across the doctor's face. Specifically, the 12 veterans whose medical records were photographed on your personal phone. The same phone that pinged location data matching access times to patient rooms. The same phone that contains 147 separate images of classified medical information from active intelligence assets. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze in the next bed over. Sarah spoke up from the nurse's station, her voice shaking. He was always on his phone in patient rooms. We thought he was checking references. Another nurse stepped forward. He asked me to pull records after hours. Said it was for quality review. Mercer's phone buzzed. His lawyer. His wife. The medical board. He didn't answer. The door opened. 2 MPs in dress uniforms stepped inside. They moved toward Mercer with the same fluid precision that Katie recognized from combat deployment, apex predators who knew exactly how to secure a target. They took his arms gently but with absolute finality, reading rights in voices that carried no judgment and required no argument. You have the right to remain silent. The words continued as they walked him out. They passed Sarah. Past the unit board. Past the break room. Past the nurses who'd watched him humiliate Katie in front of a patient's family, and there was something in their eyes now that looked like recognition. Like they understood, finally, what they'd been witnessing. General Webb's hand came up. One trembling arm, still weak from surgery, still wrapped in 4 lines, but moving with deliberate intention. His hand rendered a slow, formal salute to the Navy Cross ribbon pinned inside the citation folder now lying open on Katie's empty scrubs. She stood there in her civilian clothes, without her badge, without her cover, without the carefully constructed identity that had carried her through 27 months of waiting. She stood there as Captain Katie Rodriguez, and she let herself be seen. 6 months later, Katie was back at Seattle General. Not as a nurse. As a visitor. As a woman with a new cover identity and a new assignment somewhere in Virginia, but with one day carved out to tie up loose ends. Sarah texted her a photo. Dr. Mercer in a community college classroom, teaching CPR to a roomful of students who would never know he'd been a physician. He was wearing a polo shirt with the college logo. Minimum wage and a medical license suspended pending federal trial on espionage charges. The caption read, "Calm as a bitch." Katie didn't respond. She was already 3 states away by the time the message landed, already settling into the next role, already weaving the threads of a new lie around the core truth of who she actually was. But there was one thing she needed to do first. General Marcus Webb was in rehab, walking with a cane, his color good. The shrapnel wounds were healing. The cardiac trauma from the thoracotomy was stabilizing. He'd live. That part had worked. That part had been worth it. When he saw Katie in the doorway, he sat up straighter, and he rendered a slow, deliberate salute to the Navy Cross ribbon pinned inside the citation folder now sitting open on his bed. The citation that listed 17 surgeries under fire. The citation that explained why a nurse's hands never trembled. "You took over my aid station," Katie said quietly. She didn't come into the room. She stood in the doorway, the threshold between her 2 worlds. "That mortar round was meant for me." Webb shook his head. "It was meant for whoever was doing the work. That day, it was me. Last month, it was you." He handed her something. A faded unit patch. The original one from her deployment, the twin to the one already sewn inside her jacket lining. "I heard Mercer thought you were weak because you wouldn't fight back." Webb's smile was slight. He didn't understand that the strongest warriors choose their battles. Katie accepted the patch. Added it to the collection already hidden in the lining. And walked out past the physical therapy room where other veterans were learning to walk again, past the rehab center where nurses were nodding respectfully, past all of it, carrying the reminder of what she'd sacrificed for. Some missions are worth blowing your cover for. Some people are worth the cost. The faded patches stayed where they belonged, next to her heart, sewn into the lining of every jacket she'd ever wear, the twin reminders of a work that wouldn't ever appear in newspapers or citation ceremonies. Just a nurse keeping vigil. Just a Marine keeping faith. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever felt underestimated at work, if you've ever chosen to do the right thing even when it cost you everything, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Katie's position? Would you have saved him or walked away?